introduce Dr. Harry Glover, or you say Glover, how do you spell it?
Glover.
Yeah, and you pronounce it Glover?
Yes.
Fine. Now, Dr. Harry Glover has done a lot of work in perennial crops, and actually perennial crops and deep-rooted crops are many seen as one of the major possibilities to get more soil carbon. And we are looking very much forward to hearing about this. Okay, thank you. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be here, and I'm very grateful for those of you that helped get me here. I've had a wonderful time here in Sweden. This is my first time in Sweden, and I was very much looking forward to it. I've been here since last Sunday and have had the great opportunity to travel around a bit and be up in the north with the 24-hour sunlight, and it's been a wonderful time. It certainly has lived up to all my expectations. Well, thanks to Matthew for touching on some of those very big topics. And that's very relevant to what I will talk about now. I'm just going to cover some of the roles that perennials might play and compare them in small ways to our current annual dominated agricultural systems, and work through some of the overarching concepts and principles that I think we can use to think through the possibilities. I'll leave it to Keith on the more detailed technical aspects, but I think I'll just touch on some of the bigger concepts that Keith will provide more details on. I should say I'm with the sort of the CETA's equivalent in the U.S. Agency for International Development. So I primarily oversee agricultural research investments for the agency, primarily focused in sub-Saharan Africa with some work also in South Asia. But I'm sure you're all familiar with the grim assessments of the state of the planet, and much of our problems with the planet are related to how we grow our food crops. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment put out in 2005, sort of an assessment by ecologists, agronomists, and others, really identified agriculture as our biggest impact on the planet compared to urbanization, dam building, road building, and so on. Agriculture they viewed as the biggest threat in general. More recently, the Environment Program report of the UN essentially saying the same things. So what we're seeing is agriculture, the crops that we grow, the activities related to it, really disrupting some of these very important ecological processes that we rely on to maintain our air, water, soil, and wildlife. But thinking about why our agricultural activities have such high impact, we can go back to some of our natural plant communities. This is a tropical rainforest. This is a sagebrush steppe in the western United States. And this is a tall grass prairie meadow in Kansas. And pretty much anywhere you look across the planet in our natural plant communities, those that were in place before they were converted to agriculture, they were characterized primarily by being dominated by perennial plant species and growing within a certain range of diversity. So, for example, North America's native plant species, there are about 85% of them are perennials. So very dominated by perennials and growing at usually much higher levels of diversity than our agricultural systems. But I just want to take you through this perennial grassland here in Kansas and consider it perhaps as a model system to which we can compare to the annual cropping systems there in Kansas and think about those ecological processes. Now, prior to agriculture, prior to the settlement by Europeans in the late 1800s, pretty much all of Kansas was in this very nice, lush, green perennial grass. We call it the tall grass prairie. Of course, a lot of Swedes and others. We actually have quite a Swedish population in Kansas. They very quickly converted nearly all of that grassland to agriculture within 50 or 75 years. It was quite a fast conversion. Fortunately for me, with great interest in grasslands, several of us identified some remnant prairie meadows on these nice agricultural landscapes that had been preserved over the years. Now, they were preserved, though, not untouched, but harvested every year by the farmers. The grass is mowed, and then they bale it up, and they remove that for cattle feed. On these small remnant plots, they typically don't grade them. They're too small to fence in and provide water. So we can get a good idea of the amount of nutrients coming off. The farmers aren't putting any nutrients on. It's not valuable enough of a crop to add fertilizer to or anything. They're simply going in, mowing, baling, and removing. We do get some atmospheric inputs, some with rainfall and so on, bringing down some nutrients. For example, nitrogen, roughly 14 kilograms per hectare going into that prairie meadow there just from rainfall. It's a bit misleading to the photo. It looks like it's all grass, but it's actually some other plants in there, including some legumes, although from extensive studies, the legumes in those fields don't fix very much nitrogen, maybe a bit for their own use. So I don't think that the legumes in there are doing much for the nitrogen budget of that. That's a whole detailed story that would take quite a bit in its own. So again, how do they compare to high input annual cereal production? I think compared to European and UK standards, these are pretty low productive, relatively low input systems. Kansas is a very difficult place to grow crops. As my colleague says, Kansas is a terrible place to grow wheat. It's just that it grows better than just about anything else. Kansas is the #1 wheat producing state in the United States, so it actually serves as a good model crop to study when we're comparing it to the model system of grasslands. So just briefly talking about some of the yields, the carbon and nitrogen, and the ecosystem processes and how they compare across these two systems. I'm not going to go into a lot in terms of, carbon sequestration rates and so on, just talk about overall losses to the system. If you want much more technical detail on this, we put out a special volume of the journal Agriculture, Ecosystems, and Environment. 3 of those papers I'm drawing from to just quickly go through this. So just looking at inputs over here. So what we're doing, comparing the inputs in the perennial grass fields to the annual wheat fields, the outputs, the above-ground food webs, what kinds of plants there that dominate those systems, and then some of the below-ground results. It's very interesting. We looked at total budgets. Those hay meadows produced more nitrogen for export in total over the 75-year period that they've been used than the higher input annual wheat fields. For modern, in the modern instance, they still essentially match the nitrogen yield of those higher input annual crops. In the past, farmers often didn't even fertilize their annual wheat, but production was much lower. That's why I make that distinction. But throughout, pretty much on every measure and on all indicators, that harvested hay meadow is performing much better. It's putting a lot more resources, plant sugars below ground to drive that below ground ecosystem, feeding the soil organisms and so on. And what we find is that the annual wheat fields have much lower soil quality. So just some of the numbers fairly quickly on this. I use nitrogen because from one system they're harvesting hay, from the other system they're harvesting wheat. So I use nitrogen removal as a rough standard. And even under modern circumstances where the annual wheat fields are receiving 60 or so, sometimes 70 kilos per hectare more nitrogen through fertilizer inputs than the perennial grass. Still, the removal rates, the yield, the nitrogen yield from both systems is essentially the same. And from that, you would expect, since those hay meadows are not receiving inputs, it's essentially just a mining operation, you would expect to see some serious declines in nutrient status and soil health. But in fact, even after 75 years of continual removal, we still have much higher levels of total carbon, and I should mention this is down to a meter depth. So we found differences, significant differences quite deep in the soil profile with those perennial grasses pumping a lot of carbon and storing a lot of nitrogen below ground. So even our overall total nitrogen pools are quite a bit higher than in that wheat field, despite the fact, again, that it's simply a mining operation, the farmers going in and withdrawing those nutrients. And I think that's largely due, again, to the much greater root systems below ground. This is kilograms of root carbon below ground, with these X's indicating the levels in the perennial grasslands, much smaller levels, much shallower depths in that annual crop field. None of this is very surprising to those of us studying this, but I think it's useful to just keep this in mind. Over here we have an image of some of those perennial plant communities with the roots extracted and washed. There's about 3 or 4 species in there, some with very nice deep tap roots tapping into deep soil, water, and nutrients. And this is the wheat in its fullest extent. And remember, with the annual system, much of the year there would be no roots in there. They have to develop those from scratch each year, growing from seed. Whereas those perennial grasses maintain that cover and living root system year round. So there's a lot longer activity, capturing all the sunlight that during the growing season, the rainfall and so on. A lot of biological activity. So it's not just the depth of the roots, but it's also the growing period of the year. And very visible differences on the right here, taken from 1 meter, so 3 feet down in the ground. You see soil with much better structure. I think you can still distinguish a darker color, that richer carbon content, and quite a few roots, even down at 3 meters. And for those of you not familiar with soil science, most of us, when we're doing soil science, we stick to the surface 15 or 20 centimeters. So this is pretty phenomenal that you go down that deep and find a difference. This was taken from an adjacent no-till field. No-till is one of those better options for annual cropping systems, but lighter color due to the reduced carbon, no roots. We essentially find no roots down that deep, and also visible differences in soil structure. We did a further study. We thought, well, maybe the poor soil health in the annual crop fields are artifacts of outdated, obsolete farming practices like deep tillage and so on. Lots of disturbance and poor fertility management. So we actually took some plots in those native sites and did a no-till conversion using herbicides, no tillage whatsoever, and then looked at the results over years. And fairly quickly we found we were observing reductions in the active carbon. We saw changes in the soil physical properties, and in characterizing soil food webs, we very quickly saw negative impacts on that. Again, it makes sense. The roots are not putting those energy sources below ground, feeding that below ground community and so on. One note on that, though, even after 5 years, once in a while, we would be taking soil samples and cut through some remaining thick roots from those prairie plants that were still hanging in there living, even though they had no above ground parts for several years. So they were very persistent and still feeding that no-till system, that annual system that we converted to. So a lot of so we expect maybe once those roots finally break down and die off, that's when we would see even more dramatic negative changes in that annual crop system. I guess another way of putting it is that former perennial system was still subsidizing that new annual-based system. And it's pretty obvious. We did a soil cut. Here, I think this is about 2.5 meters deep, about 2.5 meters deep. And you can see this is just a wall of roots. We washed those off. And down here, you can see that they still continue to go down. Annual wheat, and by the way, again, this is no-till, using no-till technology, and we find pretty much no roots below that 1 meter mark. So I think this is important because oftentimes I do get the question, well, perennials may be great, but we have no-till now. Why would we need perennials if we have no-till? You're not disturbing the soil surface. You're maintaining that the residues cover on the surface. That's true, and I am a big fan of no-till. I've done a lot of work in that area. But when we're talking about below ground, the effects of no-till are often primarily in that surface area, but perennials really can get you the impacts deeper down, and they're not incompatible. We can use no-till with perennials, obviously. There's a few additional examples to show that, yes, indeed, these perennial agricultural systems can be highly productive. They can be highly productive for many years with fairly low inputs or no inputs from humans, and still maintain those very important ecosystem processes. Speaking specifically to carbon and nitrogen, some of these studies looked at harvested grasslands that had been harvested for well over 100 years, and no observed declines in soil nitrogen and organic carbon. So they were essentially in equilibrium. Carbon and nitrogen inputs were essentially matched by the removal rates. So when we think about a model, ideal, sustainable agricultural system, essentially we're talking about high yields, low inputs, and low negative impacts. And that's very difficult to achieve in agricultural systems. But I think these grasslands and other natural plant communities offer us some great opportunities to take advantage of, transfer our ecological understanding of how they work, transfer that into our agricultural systems to fundamentally transform them. I think one of the key insights from this is a close-up of the dense root systems of some of those grasses. The scale here is 1 millimeter. So fairly fine detail. And I think just a general rule of thumb that we need to keep in mind, it's the processes going on at very small scales, space and time, minutes and millimeters, that are really determining the overall health of our large landscapes. Humans, I don't believe, evolved to manage and directly regulate those processes very well. We're more operating on these larger scales of what we can put our hands around or our arms around, I guess, is one way to put it. And farmers are responding on the scale of seasons. So they add nitrogen one time of the year or maybe 2 times, whereas these systems are transforming nitrogen on them almost in instantaneous processes. So one way I think of it is put as many of these complicated actions that humans put into farming systems, the transport of the fertilizer, the driving the tractor across the field, all these complex, high-impact activities, try to get those into our crop plants, recognizing that plants are the primary regulators of those very small-scale processes, sort of take those complex activities, get the plants, put them back in the roots of the plant, so to speak. And I think it's useful to just get a visual view of what we're talking about here. This is a wild perennial relative of our annual crop wheat. It's called intermediate wheatgrass. It's currently grown as a forage. So again, farmers will grow this, harvest it, and feed it to their livestock. It does produce a nice seed, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I'm more focused on the below ground stuff. So, thinking again about what a farmer does, goes in, pretend this is annual wheat for a minute, goes in, harvests the plant, takes the seed off, and the whole plant is gone for the rest of the year. And then the farmer must go back in, prepare the field to be planted, and it all starts from a seed. But you do that harvesting action with a perennial grass, a close relative of wheat, and it regrows the next spring. But it doesn't start from a seed. It starts from a fairly deep, fine root system. And so instead of starting with a very vulnerable surface seed, you start with something a bit more complex and ready to spring into action, actually 3 meters in the soil profile. And again, the roots just keep going and going and going. These are 3 meters long because the tube in which I grew it, that was as long as I could really manage. But it's important to remember, thinking about those processes that are being managed. As soon as the temperatures are high enough for biological activity, as soon as there's water available and nutrients available, these root systems are active. There are they're the planet's safety nets deep within the soil. Okay, but there's a hitch here. So, perennials are good. That's great. But, of course, we don't eat hay. And it's actually, complicated to feed it to livestock. We don't want to eat beef all the time, or I don't. So we need we need to eat. And in looking at what we primarily eat and what we primarily grow on our global croplands, it's this set of cereal crops, oilseeds, legumes. Our top ones are wheat, maize, maize, and rice, but also things like soybeans and so on. And of course, they're all annual crops. So again, the farmers have to start from seed, start from scratch each year. And generally, that story I told about the annual crop system in Kansas, we see the same similar impacts that farmers have experienced around the planet throughout agricultural history under communist regimes, democracies, whatever. This is a global phenomenon that's been held mostly constant throughout time. These big impacts, and a lot of this is related to how we grow these crops, and they provide more than 70% of our food calories. They will be with us. Very important that we continue eating them. So the question is, I've gone through some of the ecological principles related to perennials, but how do we, again, take those principles, apply them to producing the food that we eat? Well, I'm quite excited about a growing, rather informal global network of plant breeders focusing increasing amounts of their time on developing perennial versions of those major grain crops. Here's just a selection of the main activities. So I want to just quickly go through how we might envision developing these perennial grain crops. Here's a little bit of the spread of the different activities going on. So again, it covers quite a bit of the world. I should note Swedish University here, looking at developing a perennial oilseed crop from the Lepidium genera. So I've had some very interesting interactions with them. I'll be meeting with them on Monday. I'm very excited about that. So just focusing on intermediate wheatgrass, the plant breeders can go two routes to develop perennial grain crops. One is domesticating the wild perennial, just taking it, increasing its seed yield, getting some agronomic qualities into it. You know, these wild perennials are rather bushy, lots of leaves, very vegetative, fairly low seed yield, but actually quite productive overall. So what do the plant breeders do? They start selecting for the traits that they desire. You know, bigger seeds. There's a lot of variation within those wild populations. So they start selecting for larger seed size, maybe selecting for the seed coming out of these husks a little easier to make harvest and winning, make the harvest a little easier. And then we can actually make pretty dramatic gains within a short period of time because we're starting fairly low. I think they're able on some of these improved varieties up to like 500 kilos per hectare yields under good conditions. That's actually quite low compared to our current annual crops, but they're moving that up fairly fast. So changes and we can see these physical changes fairly quickly. These are both at the same scale, the yardstick there, and so roughly at a meter. So they've actually selected for a bit more of a compact plant, thicker stems, fewer leaves, a little bit more efficient capture of sunlight, and more going into the seed head rather than into all that leafy material. So fairly quick changes. That's the story of plant domestication for our current crops too. So that's just kind of the classic way of developing a crop. It has a very nice seed. This is our very famous Martha Stewart. Some of you may have heard of. There she's eating a cookie that was actually baked from wheatgrass flour that the institute that I used to work at sent to her. She did that on TV, so that it's great. It's great seed, but again, yield. We're a growing global population. Yield is not an insignificant factor here. So another way, so that's direct domestication, just taking the wild one, improving it, getting better traits. The other way is that plant breeders can cross that wild relative with our nice domestic crop, and they get a hybrid. And the offspring are very differ in qualities quite a bit, but then those offspring can be crossed back to either the wild parent or their crop parent or others. And you can see with just a couple of crosses, this is wheat crossed by wheatgrass, and then that offspring is crossed back to wheatgrass, and you get some improvements over the wild wheatgrass here on the right. Alternatively, you make the wheat by wheatgrass cross, then cross the offspring back to the annual parent, and you can see that. And then what the plant breeder is trying to do is maintain the perenniality, increasing the agronomic traits. So what's the practical benefit? I was in Kathmandu a year and a half ago and just happened to run into a plant breeder there working for the Nepal Agricultural Service. Here he is standing in the field with one of his farmers that he works with. And he was excitedly telling me that he had gotten some seeds from the institute that I used to work at, and he had begun a plant breeding program based on them. And so I asked him, well, why are you doing that? Why would you be interested in that? He works in a very challenging environment in western Nepal, steep slopes, harsh climate, and it's a big struggle. There's a lot of stunting, malnutrition, low crop yields, and so on. So he was wanting food and forage security. These are crop livestock systems. That's important to note because not only weren't they getting enough seed to eat from their wheat, but they weren't producing abundant amounts of vegetation for the animals. So he foresaw growing perennial wheat, harvesting the seed, then letting it regrow as perennials do after harvest, and then feeding that extra fodder to the livestock. But a key there was minimizing the workload on those women farmers, often who during the active growing season are working 18 hours a day. A big part of the labor inputs to those cropping systems is the preparation of the field to be planted. It's backbreaking work. It's all done by hand, and you're planting these vulnerable seeds. If you don't get the rain just right in the right time, or if you get too much of it, that little seedling will fail to establish. He wanted to take some of the uncertainty of that out and grow perennial. This is a second-year perennial wheat hybrid that he's sitting beside. Still needs some work, but it shows some of the promise that we can imagine. More stable grain and biomass yields, take out some of the variability, and also on the nutrient. Those landscapes had been farmed for very long periods of time. Few of the micronutrients are returned. You can't just apply very expensive fertilizers in these challenging circumstances. So tapping into those deeper soil resources for improved nutrition. A side benefit that he had not expected was that the crossing of these wild hybrids with the annual crop introduced some new disease resistance pathways. Yellow rust in that region is an awful thing, wipes out crops. And new improved wheat varieties that are resistant often break down, but this introduced some new pathways to resist this yellow rust. So whenever I talk about perennial grains, I get a few frequently asked questions, or actually concerns, I think. We're approaching 9 to 10 billion people that will have to be maintained. Can perennials do it? And then we also think, one of the benefits of an annual crop is that they're fairly short-lived. So if diseases come in, they get their seed produced, you harvest it, and then it doesn't matter if it dies or not. So aren't perennials essentially sitting ducks for disease and pests? Won't they build up over time? And then we also worry about, these are perennials. Is there a problem? Is there a potential that they're going to become a weed problem and farmers won't be able to remove them from the fields? And then, of course, other people have said, well, we're pretty much up against it, Jerry. We really got to push our agricultural productivity up. Do we have time to develop perennials and get them on the landscape in time to save us from certain destruction? So is there time to do this? So on the yield, a lot of the landscapes where we need higher agricultural yields, the yields are not limited by the upper limit, the upper yield of the crop. They're limited by biophysical constraints of the landscape, poor soils, uncertain weather conditions, and so on. But even on the best soils, perennials have a much higher yield potential oftentimes, especially when we consider the below ground potential. But of course, we're interested in the seed yield. But yes, plant breeders can reallocate some of the resources of the above ground material and get more seed yield. It'll have to be ultimately proven, but theoretically it's very possible. The other thing is, in many of these parts of the, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, the average yields of maize are often 1 ton per hectare or less. That's about 10 times less than we get in the United States. So, we don't perennials don't even have to match what we're getting in Iowa on our maize yields. They need to improve the productivity in places like sub-Saharan Africa, and improve those biophysical conditions. So yield isn't the only consideration. You have to think about the whole system. Plus, if you're producing grain and animal fodder, then your grain yield doesn't have to be as high as an annual crop because you're essentially getting two different yields off of that. And I think that multifunctionality is the key. You need to produce grains, but farmers need other goods, especially in developing countries. They need livestock fodder. You need reduced labor. You know, it's the whole package that you must consider on this yield question. We also need to think about time. Many times, thank you, I have to think about time. Many times, you know, the annual crop, very high productivity for the first few years, then due to the landscape degradation, those yields go down. If we can maintain moderate yields for longer, that's far better than high yields for short periods of time. Pests and disease. Actually, perennials are often inherently more resistant to pests and disease. My wife did a lot of work on screening these perennial crops for disease resistance, and they are actually much higher. I think there's a great potential, though, to increase the diversity of farms with rotations with annuals and perennials. I'm not all about just getting rid of annuals, but by integrating these systems together, we can actually diversify and get some pest and disease improvements from that. And similar systems are already being used by farmers, particularly in these developing countries, and we've documented some of those different approaches, such as, for example, this push-pull system that we talked about this morning over coffee. And of course, as that Nepalese plant breeder pointed out, these wide crosses between the wild perennials and the annuals can introduce some novel disease pathways. The plant breeders have said, well, the trouble is going to be not with them being weedy, but through the improvements in agronomy, we need to get them to where they're robust for several years. They're less worried about a runaway perennial monster. They're wanting to, because they have to balance these different needs, they don't expect weediness to be a big concern. I think, we can't take that lightly. Time, we actually have some examples of perennial grain crops. This perennial grain legume pigeon pea is already being used. So there's progress now. Just some estimates that I come up with for perennial sorghum and rice. We'll have some solid field trials, I think, within 5 years, maybe farmer ready within 15. It's hard to tell. Plant breeding tools are changing so rapidly, giving us much greater hope. I will say we're much further along now than I thought we would be 10 years ago. Perennial wheat take longer, perennial maize quite a bit longer, although again with these new plant breeding tools it might be better. So I think there's a lot of hope. We can do this if we put some resources toward it. And I do think getting perennial grain crops is a reasonable next step. On climate mitigation through soil carbon storage, if that is possible, despite the challenges of it's a lot easier to lose soil carbon than to gain it. Getting it out is much easier and faster than getting it back in. But if that is going to be a big component, I think perennials are going to have to be a big part of that. Fewer inputs mean fewer greenhouse gas emissions in the planting and so on. More roots below ground mean more carbon. On the adaptation side, I think the picture is much clearer, much more positive. We have good evidence in excessive rainfall events or drought events or uncertain weather conditions. Perennials do have generally much better resilience. But it's important to put things in perspective, I think, on this. So if we take the relative volumes of some of our key resources that support agriculture, here's the atmosphere. If we bunched it all up, that's the relative volume compared to the overall size of the planet. This is all water, which is more than what we have access to in agriculture. The liquid water portion is a bit smaller. But of course, what are we missing in this picture? Soil. Thank you. There's liquid fresh water. So already in many parts of the world, we're diverting over 60% of the available fresh water to agriculture. So we've got, we're kind of up against that limit. But what we're really limited on, and I see it in my work in Africa very clearly, this soil resource, non-renewable and very vulnerable, very fragile. So climate change is a big issue, and mitigation is a big issue, but a key to that will be to maintain our very small, fragile soil resource. Anyway, I'd be happy to answer any questions that I'm capable of. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. This is fantastic. I was very impressed by your carrying that all the way from the United States.
And up to Abisko and back.
But it's important to think about this.
Thank you.
It was great to see. I remember from my agricultural college when we looked at his profiles.
Right, yeah.
They were not as tall.
Yeah, it's tough to get down that deep.
Well, I'm sure we have many questions, and Inge, if you help me, I think we go through. And if you speak in the microphone and introduce yourself, it would be great.
Hello, my name is Godia Kimanzu. I work for WeEffect, formerly Swedish Cooperative Center of Agroforestry. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I was just wondering, the perennial system in the States, have you managed to influence agricultural practice in those states where people can clearly see the benefits with the perennial system, with the annual system? And are there the incentives for farmers, to shift more towards perennial? And I guess you also talked about Africa, where you're doing the same work in Africa. Are you looking at also influencing policies so that as they see the benefits with the perennial system, combined with the breeding, then the governments can come in with sort of incentives to shift from the annual production system?
Okay, well, first, because we don't yet have perennial grains really farmer ready, it's difficult, it's impossible really for farmers to shift to those. But there are other options in the United States and around the world. If we think about reintegrating livestock back onto our farms, currently we're producing a lot of grain in the United States. I think some 70% of it's diverted for livestock feed, livestock operations being very separate from our actual agricultural systems. Policies have encouraged that, and there aren't many incentives to get them back together. And in fact, the current incentives are to further convert any remaining grasslands, perennial grasslands, back into maize because of subsidies and other issues. So right now it's very challenging in the U.S. My work in Africa, yes, we do support, for example, some of the research on these integrated annual perennial systems that provide a lot of benefits, not just in direct human food production, but for the integrated livestock systems that are so common there. I think these pigeon pea maize systems and combined oftentimes with agroforestry can be transformative, and the research investments that I oversee, we do include those options.
Thank you. Jörgen, I think you were the next.
Okay, Jörgen Andersson, Fjällbete. Thank you for a great presentation. You leave me with this question about our ruminants. Ruminants being to be considered as a part of the soil system, soil community. And when you showed us this comparison with the two systems of the prairie and the wheat system, to me that one of the reasons for that prairie to be productive for such a long time is that they've been mimicking ruminants with the tractor mowing it. And it's still not as good as actually using ruminants and using them as a mean of harvesting. And I make that comparison.
Yeah.
If you really put them to the
a well-managed grazing system would be an improvement. I've seen poorly managed grazing systems that don't result in the same. But I do agree with you. It would have made my nutrient budgets much more complex, so I was grateful that they were using mowing machines rather than cattle. But no, I do agree with you, and I'm very much in favor in integrated mixed crop livestock systems. But those were actually too small to be practical for bringing the cattle in. You'd have to bring in a water support, fence them, and all that, which is actually why they were also not used for agriculture. Too small and irregularly shaped. Very fortunate for me.
Okay. Sorry, the green. Not your name, please.
Hi, Kim Nicholas from Lund University. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. So I'm now convinced that you are going to breed these perennial grasses, and I'm excited about that, but I want to know what your plan is for getting them adopted. As we know, it's not always the technical or the biophysical limitations that prevent us from doing things in the right way, and I'm wondering how you're working with farmers to prepare them for 5 to 10 to 15 years from now when you have these perennials ready, and also how to incentivize them or get them ready to actually adopt them, and what are you doing about the agricultural policy and the big companies who probably have a strong incentive to prevent their uptake?
Several questions there. To my shame, I actually don't do the breeding, and I don't do much of the work. I do most of the talking. When this happens, as I'm confident it will not be it won't be because of anything that I do. I think in terms of preparing farmers and working with them, I think the clearest example is Drew Bathapa, the Nepalese plant breeder who works every day with farmers and interacting with them. The farmers I see that will most likely benefit the soonest and the most from this are those smallholder farmers in very challenging farming landscapes, and they already use perennials quite widely. They would use them more, I believe, if they had access to perennials that actually produced the very valuable, nutritious grains that they do rely on for both income and calories. So the big limitation right now for greater adoption of perennials is the fact that very few, if any, perennials that are there really aren't perennials available that produce those grains. In terms of large corporations, I think it remains to be seen. Certainly in the areas I work, they don't have much influence right now. It's more small and medium-sized seed companies, seed producers, and so that's a question that remains to be seen. I see some glimmers of hope. There are types of ways and there are scenarios in which larger seed companies would take this up. For example, a hybrid wheat can be much more productive. That's where the seed that the farmer plants, the seeds produced from that won't be as good, so it's a hybrid, so they have to buy them every year. But for wheat, the hybrid wheat seed is too expensive for farmers to buy, so it's really not, there's pretty much no hybrid wheat production right now. It's possible, but if you had a perennial hybrid and you get those benefits from hybridization and a more expensive seed, if you only had to plant it once every 3 years or 5 years, then it's of much greater benefit to the farmer, making it economically possible and attractive to the seed producers. I don't know if I probably didn't say that very clearly, but there are some scenarios in which the seed producers, I think, would be interested. And not all of the seed producers are against these perennial-based systems. In Zambia, Pioneer Seed Company is very proud that they test all their maize varieties, hybrid maize varieties in Zambia in agroforestry systems, because the perennial-based nature of that system makes the yields more reliable, makes the use of fertilizers much more effective, so takes the risk of just growing an annual crop alone out of it, and that incentivizes farmers to invest in the more expensive seed and fertilizers.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for this. Björn Lundgren, first of all, I'm from KSLA. This is for an agricultural forestry ecologist and the soil scientist, as I am original. This is a highly interesting development, and the research and development efforts going into this, I can only applaud them. I can only look at them with the great excitement and so on. But you yourself have cautioned us in one or two ways, which I think are very important, because I can already now see in many parts of the world a kind of enthusiastic jumping to this, also in the sense that let's skip all annual grain growing now and turn over to perennial. But I think some of the figures you mentioned are quite important to highlight here. It is a development effort still, both from a genetic point of view, from an agronomic point of view, and so on. And you said, I think you had a list here saying that in 20 years' time we may be ready for grain growing on perennial grains. And earlier in your speech you said that it was a kind of by-sentence, so you said the grain yield is only 500 kilos per hectare, and that is quite low. It's not quite low, it's very low. It's less than 10% of current grain yields in conventional agriculture. So I think that it's important, while enormously important, to do this research and development, and the potential benefits, this time aspect that we are far from ready yet. I think this is important to stress that.
Yeah, okay. On the 500 kilos, that referred to the improvements in wheatgrass, not the perennial wheat. And I don't have perennial wheatgrass up here because I think it's more on the order of 25 years. I think ultimately it could prove to be the much better candidate because it is a strong perennial, but it's going to take longer. So that one is further out. I will mention, though, that 500 kilos grain yield in the Sahel is quite good. It's far lower, but if we put a Swedish wheat variety in the Sahel, it would be 0. It would not yield anything. So that yield consideration, it's very important that we consider the context. And again, I don't think that we even have to approach the upper yield limit of our annuals under good optimal conditions to make perennials very attractive. But I do agree with you, the yield is a big consideration. But the perennial sorghum that I foresee being field tested in Africa soon, the seed yields are essentially equivalent to the, they're actually more concerned about some of the other agronomic qualities. For example, the perennial sorghum, much of it is like 14 feet tall with a massive seed head. So it's yielding as much as our dwarf hybrid sorghum, grain sorghums, but it's big. It's a bit massive for our mechanized systems to handle. In Africa, they would love it. That's a lot of food for their livestock.
Yeah, thanks very much. My name's Mike Jones. I don't really work for anybody.
Congratulations. Good on you.
I'm part of a number of networks that are very interested in this kind of thing, and recognizing the policy constraints, recognizing the research constraints. What kinds of networks are you aware of that link people who are actually trying to do this kind of thing in a small way on their farms with local research establishments and so on? Because I think that's really important.
Yeah. Well, again, on the perennial grain side, and I want to stress, there are many perennial-based, I shouldn't say many, there are some very good perennial-based options already out there that farmers do use. The perennial grain side, it's very difficult to work with farmers right now because they're just not commercially viable, except with the case of perennial pigeon peas, which, by the way, it's one of 3 systems we sort of characterized in a paper recently. If you're interested in those, what I call perenniation systems, I'd be happy to give you that paper. But yeah, networks and so on. We do have a pretty good global network of the plant breeders and agronomists interested in this. We have a special division of the Agronomy Society of America focused on perennial grain crops, and we will be holding a meeting in November and bringing them in. The FAO is convening a large global perennial grain conference in Rome in August. So we have on the research side a pretty good network and some support, growing research budgets for those. The USDA is getting behind this. at least some of us at USAID are very much behind this, and other donor foundations are increasingly interested. Again, the farmer networks are difficult because, you know, it just isn't quite ready on the perennial grain side yet.
Well, thank you. My name is Lennart Båge, member of the Academy. And you touched a bit on it right now, but I want, if you could elaborate a bit about the funding. A lot of research, a lot of development is needed over the longer time.
Yeah.
And how do you see funding interests in national systems, in the international, in the CGIAR system, and in the private sector? And where do you see the priorities in terms of increased funding?
Yeah. So we had a meeting at the Bill